Hello, everybody. I'm Jim Hicks, Executive Editor of the Massachusetts Review, and I want to begin by welcoming you all to this reading and celebration of the 2021 winner of our magazine's Anne Halley Prize for Poetry, Abigail Chabitnoy. In recent years, it has become conventional to begin public events by acknowledging their location on unceded native lands. I suspect our audience today will not need a reminder of this simple yet brutal fact of history. And certainly our prize-winning poet does not. It is nonetheless important for people like me to recall that the place that I call home and the land that the state believes I own does in fact lie in the hunting hills of the Pecumtuck and Nonotuck peoples, just to the north of the University of Massachusetts Amherst, a state institution that is located in a town named for a settler colonial war criminal. I'd also like to acknowledge our neighboring indigenous nations, the Nipmuc and Wampanoag to the east, the Mohegan and Pequot to the south, the Mohican to the west, and the Abenaki to the north. Now, to the extent that such acknowledgments become formulaic rather than educative, they lose their primary purpose. However, since this event is hosted by a so-called land-grant university, it does seem appropriate to remind folks that granting land, even for a laudable purpose, is founded in injustice when the land hasn't been ceded. Perhaps to echo a recent proposal made regarding our national parks, our land-grant institutions too should be administered by Native peoples. We're grateful for the support the Mellon Foundation has recently given to Native American studies in the 5-college consortium, which along with UMass includes Amherst College, Hampshire College, Mount Holyoke College, and Smith College, all institutions that support this magazine as well. We've benefited from the generosity of many funders, including the National Endowment for the Arts, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, and the Dreyfus Foundation. We're grateful to them all. And over this past year, we've been particularly touched by the exceptional support of our readers, contributors, and donors, all of whom have stepped up and stood up for us. So we thank you all. And with that, I'll turn it over to poetry editor Ellen Doré Watson, who will introduce our 2021 Anne Halley Prize winner.
Hello, everyone. We're glad you're here with us tonight. As has been our custom, I'll begin by reading a poem by Anne Halley, poet, teacher, and longtime MR poetry editor, whose friends and colleagues at UMass underwrite this annual prize in her memory and honor. The prize celebrates one poem from the year's 4 issues of the magazine and is judged by the poetry editors, myself and Deborah Gorlin, along with a third judge, a local scholar or poet. I'm going to start with the Anne Halley poem, A Garden, from her second book called The Bearded Mother. A garden, physical, at ease in air, brilliant in its right senses, changeable, an ordered cherishing of all we are and could become with care. A continent, an island, or a garden, hillocks, graves that shelter where the patient gardener saves. Be garden. Come into our flesh and blood. If flesh is grass, that we could be as true as any sentient meadow, rich as earth, in our right seasons, sane, the furrows cut, the fullness gathered to our gardening good. Be whole, a garden, come into our own, clear as the apple, honey pouched as figs, revealed as sharply as the orange blood, annunciatory essence. Seasonal, praise our good gardening as our juices fall. Say we were sick then, fantasize and say a peaceable, phantasmal heirdom. Not what we are, but as we willed to be. Not as we were, but as we would become. This year, MR's new incoming poetry editor, Nathan McLean, joined me and Deborah Gorlin, who are retiring just around now, to reread the year's worth of poetry. It was quite a treasure trove, and we had a blast reading our favorites out loud, discussing their strengths, and finally narrowing down to a last few. Ultimately, our choice was absolutely unanimous. Abigail Chabitnoy's Girls Are Coming Out of the Water. The poem appeared in last winter's Crazy Beautiful special issue, a gathering of Native voices. I just have to hold up this cover to show you. This is artwork by Rose B. Simpson, and there's an art section inside. Our art editor, Pamela Glavin, gathered. If you don't have this issue, Eddie's going to put in the chat a link to get it, and also to get the wonderful broadside of the poem. So the poetry was curated by Deb and myself for the special issue, along with our guest poetry editor, which we want to thank once more, Tacey Atcity. Abigail Chabitnoy's poems have appeared in Boston Review, Tin House, Lit Hub, Gulf Coast, and many other top magazines. She was recipient of the Witterbinner funded Native Poetry Residency and is a mentor in the MFA at the Institute of the American Indian Arts. Abby is a Koenig descendant and member of the Tanganake Native Village in Kodiak, Alaska. She's the author of How to Dress a Fish from Wesleyan University Press, which won the 2020 Colorado Book Award for Poetry and was shortlisted for the prestigious Griffin Prize. How to Dress a Fish is a unique and remarkable book. Built from and inspired by archival materials, photographs, historical documents, school and family records. The book includes diagrams, crossouts, brackets, and erasures, born of the passion to know and a prodigious creativity. It's an incantatory, obsessive quest for an origin story, for a legacy the speaker grew up knowing little of, obscured as it had been by fictitious, whitened, euphemistic history. Born in Pennsylvania, Abby earned a BA in anthropology and English and went on to an MFA at Colorado State at the University of Fort Collins, where, as she says in an interview, I realized I could use my graduate studies not just to learn about poetry, but to learn my language, my history, my stories. Studying Aleutic culture and history, Russian and otherwise Western colonization and storytelling traditions. She goes on, the complexity of my relationship to my heritage, however, insisted that I continue to question that form and my motives at each step. Stories were told, then told again and again, not necessarily in succession or in replacement, but through accretion as waves upon a shore. The native Hawaiian writer, Christina Kahakawila, speaks about the ways in which exterior physical patterns in our natural and cultural worlds can provide patterns for our own interior storytelling. And I found this to be true as I wrote from the perspective of one at once descended from and removed from a water-based people, unquote. Here are just a few lines that I pulled from various parts of the book that speak to this and moved me. Who gets to be of the water? Who gets to be people above or below the sea? I am learning by my hand how big my hand is. One face is not enough to adapt, to survive, to be both predator and prey. I tried to hold the place in the sea where we should be. As the book jacket notes, quote, in uncovering her own family records, Chabitnoy finds that reconnection through blood and paper does not restore the personal relationships that had already been severed. Though I found it to be a celebration of family and extension across generations. And I would echo Matt Hooley's words, also from the book jacket, How to Dress a Fish is a stunning investigation of archive, loss, and kinship. These poems linger in histories erased by US colonialism, not toward recovery, but to study those modalities of mourning, attachment, and invention through which living proceeds nonetheless. That they do so is, to my mind, a great gift to the reader. When we met the poem, Girls Are Coming Out of the Water, first as a submission for the special issue, and then as a contender for the Halley Prize, it was the first piece of Abby's that we'd read. We knew nothing of her book or her honors. We only knew we could not look away. As I can see now, the poem shares much with those in the book. The engine of accretion, repetition, chant, propulsion, and additionally, as other recent poems of Abby's that I've read since, explores and embodies current concerns and stories from which we must not look away. As poet Joan Navailuk Kane claims, this work insists upon the necessity of poetry. Please join me in welcoming Abigail Chabitnoy.
Shmai, Kayana, Ellen, thank you. Thank you to Nathan and to Ellen and Jim and Deborah, and especially Tacey, the editors of that Native Voices issue. It's truly an honor and a pleasure and a privilege to join you all this evening. And it's so nice to continue to find ways of insisting on poetry's presence and relevance amidst everything. So, wow, sorry, I'm just a little floored by that introduction. So I'm going to read around a bit tonight from some of the works I've been doing. Some threads that carry across the different works are narratives of violence as facilitators of continued violence, but also looking at how through narrative to imagine alternative possibilities, and how language for me has really become a site both of rupture, but also regeneration. And I think that's a theme that sort of continues through the work. And so a lot of these images that recur are just images that continue to haunt me and follow through. And as Ellen alluded to, How to Dress a Fish started this inquiry and idea of narrative like the waters that both separate and join the islands in the Aleutian chain that my family was removed from, as a gesture of returning to community that has been lost through US assimilation policies and boarding school, and looking at the ways in which that language continues to carry those relationships, those histories, those stories, and also ways in which it's capable of forging new paths, new rivers, new channels as well. So I'll start with some poems from this collection and then move into a chapbook that I just had released, and then some of this new work as well. So thank you. Chabitnoy, translation, Salmon Fisher, Michael Chabitnoy, Aleut. Because they were of the water, because they were given Russian names, he was born with hushed words. Because his mother had a bad heart and his father was traumatized, they took him from the sea. Because he came to the school charitably before, because there is only one photo after, they told the skeptics, yes, it can be done. Because it could be done, because Indian marries white girl, because he died of consumption, there are words I can't say. Because he was survived by 2 sons, because they were called half-breed. Because that second son took to drink, I've always been afraid of the sea. Because it doesn't mean salmon fisher. Because I need to know I can say these words. Because it means mischievous, energetic. Mischievous men and women fish for salmon energetically. because he was an orphan, because in summer my skin turns redder than my father's, because they asked my mother, is she adopted? Because I too am of the water, because I hear these words, I will split my bones and fit my skin to the sea. I will shape my mouth to angle these words with the wind. And this next poem is in conversation with the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, which could be its own presentation. So I won't go too far into that detail, but speaking of this notion of land acknowledgements and how they fall short, but they're also such a vital reminder. A lot of this book came out of the fact that I grew up an hour from Carlisle and never knew the horrors of that history until well into my college years. And so the way in which growing up in Pennsylvania and really feeling that Indigenous people were past tense and really removed from that land, I think is what makes those acknowledgements at least a starting point in, recognizing the continued presence and the continued thriving of Indigenous peoples. And so this poem is called Survey of Resource Articulation, from Title 43, US Code Chapter 33, Section 1630, claims arising from acquisition of entitlement on behalf of relocated persons resulting from unintended contamination of transferred qualities. Such persons begin to question A, how the land will be used, for whom. B, how one will use one's arms, for whom. C, how one is to understand these and other such provisions without knowing the story, without hearing the story the way it is told, without hearing it spoken, speaking. I dream of the sea since a girl. Each time I die, I lay my body on a bed of shells, hollowed to be strung, each body having died, multiple, like misplaced boulders, erratic, like fire rock, shape the shoreline. D, to what extent they are visible in their bodies. E, whether stasis is a matter of upbringing, one can walk for days and still see major landmarks seemingly unchanged. The mountain remains a mountain any way you look at it. F, where one should migrate when there is only one season. G, how it is here in the beginning of the world, a mountain is a thing that grows. H, how it is not here, removed, relocated, qualities are transferred. One acquires the persistence of mountains. I, how to be like the sea, the line, the wave, the shore. And I'll just read a couple more from these. Before there was a train, I built my home from perfumed skins and crooked bones, far from the rotting boat. They took the wrong shape. Sod, not ice, not body, not other. Nikik, ongluch nichimich badamok. The wrong tongue. By the time you read this, I will have forgotten how to say the house is covered with sod or home. Part of me wishes it had sunk, it sank, it is sinking. But these sentences have not been written. Only ashrane shuut kachainak paku tartut. Sometimes people salvage some stuff. And because this book is as much interested in ways that culture persists and continues to build and be a living, progressing, present entity, I also wanted to work in this poem with traditional subsistence practices through language and looking how to relate, how to connect through language and through poems with traditions that further ruptured through blood quantum laws, US regulations, all this kind of paperwork. There are pockets of my culture that I have access to and welcomed with open arms, and there are pockets of my culture that, due to these sort of imposed regulations, I am continued to be barred from. And so trying to enact some of that ritual quality, some of that participation and presence through poetry. And so there are a couple poems that share this title, and this theme persists, I think, in later work. But this last one I'll read from this book is Ways to Sustain. Break the body along the ribs, off spine. Hang in the wind until black to keep. Dry the skin in borrowed sand until watertight. Smear the skin with oil from the body. Carry company, ivory-eyed and whiskers and treated blades of grass, dipped in earth and build at proper length. Properly angled, properly protected in skin boat. The sea, one you see. Swallow the fish, feed whole the hungry mouths, belly full with the sea. There is only water, salt, and air. Drag the bones ashore. The water was at fault, and the land was at fault. Only the current is faultless. And so I'm going to switch modes and read from, I was fortunate at sort of what now was we recognize as the beginning of this pandemic and this lockdown, to still find a way to attend the Elsewhere residency in Paonia, Colorado, funded by the Winter Bitter Foundation. And it was this really great generative experience, but also finding myself sort of living alone in a very rural place in a house that was larger than I needed at the time of the George Floyd protests and a lot of civil unrest. It felt like a strange time to be leaving Denver to go to this retreat of sorts, and gave me a lot of freedom to think in terms of fractal poetics, fragments, but also working with linocuts and working with images and really playing with how to find narrative and make a whole out of the pieces. And so my chapbook that came out of that project, Converging Lines of Light, really leans into this idea of the site of wound as womb. And so, as I said, exercise in fractal narrative poetics with English and Suggestoon, which is the Alutiiq language. And it's really a reckoning and a summons. And I'm just going to read a little bit of that. I was able to write an entire poem in Suggestoon in this book, but I have not yet summoned the courage to read through all of that aloud. The language, the consonants, the sounds, there are a lot of nuances that I'm still learning to speak my language. And so that is on the horizon, but in the chapbook, there's more of this language. I'm just going to read a little excerpt from the beginning and then one of the closing poems that plays with a motif from the Alutiiq culture of this figure who was neglected by her community and essentially cast into the bottom of the ocean, where she has sort of resurrected as a kind of deity figure who is responsible for releasing sea game for the hunters to be able to catch. So essentially, this cast out figure became responsible for whether or not communities survived, whether or not there was enough food, and she would withhold her gifts based on the neglect she suffered. So there's this motif of having to comb her hair and to tend to this figure and essentially tend to the land and tend to the relationships there. And so this idea of this woman cast aside and cast out becoming a figure of power and both benevolence and also reckoning is one of the central motifs of this work. Local catastrophes in the kingdom of nowhere. The oldest survived in the deep, in the water. Call her persistent. Call her survivor. Call her mother. Call her the one who remains. The line, the river cuts. The earth opened and great quantities of water were cast out. Many people were swallowed up in these rents. The earth caught some of them by the middle and squeezed them to death. The heads of others only appeared above ground. Worlds have ended before. We forget. Begin again. Yeah, just scrolling to the next piece because I have not received my physical copy of it yet. In the renderings, of which there are many, there is a note. Their origin had ideas. They fell from the sky. The ideas, or the people, or a bitch was the island, or the island was a bitch, and, or brindled the children swam, the old goat. Some hold both, the dogs descended there. Still other, still. It is plain they regard a girl as habit of the island. That is, she was sent to the island, the girl, because her sons were dogs. That is, she was already an island. She is always already the island. There are so many small islands. I need a bigger map to show you. None of them say anything definite. The people had doubtless forgotten the island before the people came to be the island. The island was before. There was always an island, a before. Always she begins at sea, in a mouth, in a cave, a mother buried in the deep. That reminds me, I wanted to thank Ellen for that beautiful selection that you read, of course, at the beginning of this reading, and just the themes and the ways in which poems converse to each other. I think that's been one of my favorite effects, I guess, of being a poet, is just the community that not only these readings and these residencies and traveling to do research have opened, but just the communities that the poems themselves open and the way they continue to speak. And so I noticed a little bit of that similarity with within some of what I'll read now. I always feel like images repeat, especially the more I read, the longer I read together, the way I revisit motifs. But I'm learning too to trust some of that repetition, some of that accretion, and how that reflects the stories in my own tradition that I have read, and how that builds these relationships. So the next poems I'm going to read are from my second collection, still in manuscript form, titled Anatomy of a Wave. And this is the collection that the poem I'll later read came from. And really that poem is sort of a driving force behind behind this work. All the daughters, liminally fault or cause. Each morning and most afternoons, I brush against the moon, knock from its access. Remember, I keep living because someone else does not. Do the fish in the desert share the shore's vertigo? What does water know of the want of our hands? You think it's just shallow, but if a man or a woman is sucked into the mud flats where before they were treading leisurely the water or the dirt, if too cold to say it was leisurely, the man, the woman, or the water, but rather it wasn't certain they were drowning. Is it my fault they are there? Sea change, a gray, another father, another daughter swept in the current. Sea fault line, disambiguation. Sea fracture or crevice or crevasse. The water is trending higher these days, with or without my paper moon, and the wings in my corner are just for holding detritus. The cat's cradle hanging from the ceiling is a hazard, sure, but only if you come at it from the wrong angle, the work or the moon. Rivers string through maps, through days, through lips, slipped grit. We keep living. And if each of these beings has agency, such as the dirt, you can hardly blame yourself if the tide goes out and they're left like sticks in the mud. Unless, of course, you have a boat and saw them struggling when there was still water enough to swim. How will you spin it? In August, girls sing songs and weave string figures to tangle the legs of the sun and slow its departure for winter. I would let go the sun for a fish or a bird to carry all the daughters across, and yes, the fathers and the mothers and the sons. How far have you had to run? The question to ask in such times is not why they jumped when the water was cold. What drew two bodies apart in the first place? The nature of the agency, the use of flapping. Shorelines can bewitch like that. We all want to be seen, to shine. In the current, where drowning is beautiful. White breaks first, waves green, then black, shining seas, ships sailing, not sailing, what is still, wanting wind. It used to be no man could go against, this weather too will pass. The wind is not a river. And if a puddle at the last gives way to desert, corked bottle, walled city, veiled woman, buried one, were you afraid? Cachwach tuchniuch. If air, the conscious element, sometimes breath, sometimes bird. The last few days have been windy, but the current is strong, Nicafor, and it rains all the time. Daminek, dangak, atur tapet. And sometimes, if I were not afraid, I am a fish with teeth after all. I play a bit with translation in this collection, and I don't usually read them out loud, but at the bottom of the page I have footnotes, and rather than translate directly, I did a direct translation, and then it felt redundant to have the English translation on the page with the Aleutic. In the same way that, you know, we can go back and read the classics, we can read Ezra Pound, and if you don't know French, if you don't know Latin, if you don't know Greek, you're expected to look it up. And of course, it's a little trickier because Google Translate doesn't work as well with the Alutiiq language, but it became this site of access and this site of what am I writing for whom, this idea of motives, and the way in which what gets relegated to the margins gets relegated in sort of social hierarchy as well. And so how to sort of take back that marginal space and to take back that space of mistranslation and make that also a space for generation and for new narratives to develop as well. And so all to say that I don't always translate the Alutiiq, but throughout the work, there's this underlying narrative building in that language and in that space. If not seed, let this body bear stones on the other side of the flood. Body, I am forever still trying to decide how to lay down these arms when their weight demands to be upheld, when their comfort plus depends on my complexion, or not least my come when called-liness, my propensity for lines in which to stand, my complicit course of inaction. Someday, daughter, how you sit or don't sit can make waves. Ears turn to war on the shore line, bank unyielding, distilled before the break. I am contemplating words that take the shape of O. Moon, crater, face, soul made boat, body in water, descending, tooth, hem, mother, open hand, closed fist, sight of disarticulation, every kind of red mouth. Remember Lilith? What can I say? She had too many ribs. She was bound to develop extra lungs, maybe an extra heart or two. She filled holes each time she came into the room. It was only a matter of time before they realized she just took a little longer to drown. Her extra heart won't work for you. Each time we learn the hard way, slices in one's throat don't make a body breathe under pressure. And I think I'm gonna read one more short one, maybe one longer one, and then the broadside poem. We'll see how this timing goes. But I should also, I think, thank in this work to the issue that the broadside poem came out in was the Native voices, and that community also has really been integral into my own development as a poet. The relationships I've had with those poets, with Sharon Bitsui, Joan Navajo Kane, and so many others, and the women especially, I think, that I've gotten to meet through my poems have been voices that I've wanted to give strength in this work. And Sherwin and Joan were some of the earliest readers of this next poem. If you're going to look like a wolf, they have to love you more than they fear you. The first deer had large teeth and no horns, and were not afraid. The first deer did not have enough fear for the men who needed them to survive. A woman decided to let the men eat. A grandmother decided her deer shall have horns and be afraid. Someone's mother decided the men shall eat and shall be feared. A man thought wolves should be used to cull the herd. And we who had been catching water dripping through stone in the homes we dug out of the earth, we licked our long teeth clean. and set to work. Sea change. There was a man who set out to obtain charms. Going out in a bidarka, he landed in the land he was heading for. If it were me, I'd put a small house on the water with a bird to carry dry land, and the bird would be dressed as a man. That way, when the men come for the daughters, they will simply fly away. And when the sons are carried far from the sea, it will be by their own beating wings their granddaughters will find their way home. They will say they are filling up. They won't say the bodies are filling the sound. They won't tell you the otters who were hunted were more or less human another time. Common to the Gulf waters of the people of the island that is the island people, birds in flight, anadromous fish, 3 kinds of sharks, including the sleeper, perceived non-threatening, perceived opportunistic, perceived consumed, intoxicating. Also fireweed and forget-me-nots, also stone-smoothed sinkers and fish with faces, common fish with faces, common to the water and the people of the island, that is as such stories go. A girl was not harmed by the capsizing or by taking in water, living after that on the bottom of the sea. Common to the water as such stories go, if at sea something like a swaddled child appears, we paddle to it and, passing by it, pull it out from its wrappings and go get safety away from it. One plucks out its clout. However, whoever flees from it will get taken by it. In this story, all the children live. I have a great-grandmother, and she lives. I have a grandmother, and she lives. I have a daughter, and she lives. In this story, I am not afraid of sleeping waves. In this story, I am not afraid. I am not afraid, and we live. We all live. Each sole of my fine shoes I have torn out and shaped into a finer boat, like the one who knows how to make fine boats, and give them to one's relatives one knows how to name. One knows how to believe they are living, that all the children have not died and are living still. Kayak angok, kek mikduk, tenu niten imami. When one is going to hold what one has held before, the bottom of one's palm itches. He who is to walk the following day, the sole of his foot itches. She who is to have sorrow, her throat is full. And I will close with this last poem, Girls Are Coming Out of the Water. Many of these poems in this collection especially have been written not just for Indigenous women that have been missing, but women at the border, children at the border, families at the border, but also a large number have just been influenced by this continued plight of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and how overlooked it is in our society. I think latest numbers since 2016 alone, there have been nearly 6,000 known incidents of women missing, and very few, less than 200 cases that have actually been pursued through our justice system. And so just the disproportionate violence, and looking in these poems at how our histories of violence against the landscape facilitates and enables violence against Indigenous people, which in turn facilitates and enables violence against Indigenous women, and looking for these patterns and looking for how to then also break that cycle. And for me, it's through language and through story and imagining alternative narratives. But this last poem is especially for those women and their families. And I say this because May 5th through 8th is when we raise awareness, especially for those women. And so especially if you see Indigenous women wearing red this week, that's to raise that awareness. And so again, Koyana, thank you so much to the Massachusetts Review and the editors, and to all of you for listening. Girls are coming out of the water. A child walks the familiar road. A body is found at the mile mark. Still, they do not suspect foul play. Still, they say she was not afraid. Say we are not afraid. Say we are not afraid. Say I am not afraid. And because we understand the need to maintain appearances, and because we understand the insignificance of our own threat of disappearing, say, I am not afraid. Wear only red. Each day, another goes missing. Wear red, and still they will think of what to do with you, what they'd like to do with us in our red dress. Very well. Be red like a plague, like a body of red water rising, a name held in red, rising in the throats before channels close. Be red like the mouth spitting fire in the Pacific. Be the one made mother in the beginning. Be the one made to break, to scatter light to every windowless interior. Be fire born of the sea. Be fire lit with each strike. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining.
Thank you, everyone, for being here with us. Thank you, Abby. What a banquet of words. I'm so glad you gave us samplings from your various works, and we're eager to keep following you and to see this new manuscript come to the pages and to have them in our hands. Every kind of red mouth. If you're going to look like a wolf, they have to love you more than they fear you. She who is to have sorrow, her throat is full. Be red, be fire. Please buy books. Poetry is a necessity. And please go to the links that we have on the chat if you'd like the Gathering of Native Voices or a copy of this wonderful broadside. Thank you all, but most of all, thank you, Abby.